July 16th, 1966. The sun hung like molten copper above the rolling hills of Duc Pho Province, South Vietnam. Heat shimmer danced across the rice paddies below, where water buffalo stood motionless in the baking afternoon. The monsoon rains had passed 3 days earlier, leaving the earth steaming and the air thick enough to drink. Mosquitoes rose in clouds from crater pools left by North Vietnamese mortars, their drone mixing with the distant thump of helicopter rotors cutting through the humid sky. On Hill 482, a ridge barely 400 meters above sea level, but commanding views across the entire Quang Ngai Valley, 37 Marines of Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, prepared for what their intelligence briefings had promised would be a routine reconnaissance patrol. The hilltop measured no more than 50 meters across at its widest point, crowned with bamboo groves and scarred earth where previous artillery strikes had torn away the jungle canopy. Radio antennas swayed in the hot breeze, their guy wires singing softly as they maintained connection with the world beyond the green hell of Vietnam. Among these Marines stood Lance Corporal Charles Douglas McMahon, 22 years old, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. His hands, already calloused from weeks of carrying the 30-pound PRC-25 radio, adjusted the headset for the 100th time that day. The Prick 25, as every grunt called it, represented the lifeline between ground forces and the constellation of supporting assets circling overhead. Its vacuum tubes glowed amber in the aluminum housing, broadcasting on frequencies that could reach F-4 Phantom jets at 20,000 feet, or whisper tactical updates to other Marine units scattered across the province. Without radio communication, a squad became isolated, vulnerable, forgotten. McMahon had been carrying the radio for Echo Company since their deployment to Vietnam 4 months earlier. The son of a telephone lineman, he understood electronics instinctively, could coax clear signals from damaged equipment, and had developed the calm, precise radio voice that air controllers trusted during close air support missions. His call sign, Echo 2, had become familiar to pilots across I-Corps Tactical Zone. When Echo 2 called for support, aircraft responded without hesitation. But that afternoon, confidence hung in the air like the humidity itself, thick and ultimately deceptive. At the forward operating base in Chu Lai, 30 kilometers to the northwest, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison briefed his staff with the casual assurance of men who had never walked point through triple canopy jungle. Intelligence reports indicated minimal enemy presence in the Duc Pho area. The Viet Cong, according to captured documents and prisoner interrogations, preferred to operate in the river deltas and coastal plains, where they could blend among the civilian population and disappear into tunnel systems that had been decades in the making. The hills, the intelligence officers insisted, offered no strategic value to communist forces, too exposed for base camps, too remote for supply routes, too visible to American air power. Vietnamese fighters were pragmatists, the briefings concluded. They would never commit significant forces to defend terrain they could not hold. This assessment reflected a fundamental misunderstanding that would cost American lives throughout the conflict. Western military doctrine, trained on European battlefields where terrain dictated strategy, struggled to comprehend an enemy that viewed geography as a weapon in itself. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong had learned to use Vietnam's landscape not for defense, but for offense, striking from positions that conventional wisdom deemed impossible. The PRC-25 radio that McMahon carried represented one of the most significant technological advantages American forces possessed in Vietnam. Developed by Motorola specifically for military field operations, the radio weighed 23.5 pounds with its battery pack, transmitted on FM frequencies between 30 and 76 megahertz, and could maintain clear communication over distances exceeding 10 kilometers in optimal conditions. Its solid-state construction made it more reliable than previous tube-based models, while integrated encryption capabilities protected sensitive communications from enemy interception. But technology, however advanced, remained hostage to the realities of Vietnam's terrain and weather. Mountains blocked radio waves, forcing operators to position antennas on hilltops for line-of-sight transmission. Monsoon rains shorted electrical systems. Jungle humidity corroded contacts. Most critically, the radio's range depended entirely on battery power, and batteries died quickly in the tropical heat. Every patrol carried spare battery packs, but each pack added weight to already overburdened Marines humping through terrain that seemed designed to exhaust human endurance. The strategic importance of reliable communications in Vietnam cannot be overstated. American military doctrine relied on the coordination of multiple support elements: artillery fire from distant bases, close air support from Navy and Air Force fighters, medical evacuation helicopters, and supply drops via cargo aircraft. This system, known as combined arms warfare, multiplied the effectiveness of small infantry units by providing massive firepower on demand. But coordination required communication, and communication required radios that functioned under the worst possible conditions. McMahon understood this responsibility. Every morning he performed maintenance checks on his equipment, cleaning contacts, testing frequencies, verifying encryption settings. He carried backup antennas, spare handsets, emergency batteries. His radio became an extension of his nervous system, as vital as his rifle and as carefully maintained as his relationship with the men whose lives depended on his ability to call for help. The morning of July 16th had passed quietly on Hill 482. Echo Company's mission called for a reconnaissance sweep through the valley below, searching for evidence of enemy supply routes or base camps. Intelligence suggested they would find abandoned campsites at most, perhaps cached weapons or medical supplies. The patrol would descend from the hill at 1400 hours, conduct a methodical search pattern through the bamboo groves and rice paddies, then return to the hilltop by sunset. As the Marines prepared to move out, McMahon conducted his final radio checks. He contacted the Direct Air Support Center at Da Nang, confirming that F-4 Phantom jets were on station and available for immediate response. He verified frequencies with the Artillery Fire Direction Center at Chu Lai, ensuring that 150 mm howitzers could deliver supporting fires within minutes of request. Most importantly, he confirmed medical evacuation procedures with the helicopter squadron at Marble Mountain, establishing call signs and landing zone requirements for casualty evacuation. These preparations, routine for experienced units, represented the careful orchestration that kept small units alive in hostile territory. American strategy in Vietnam depended on this coordination, using superior firepower and mobility to offset the enemy's advantages in numbers and terrain knowledge. But the system's complexity also created vulnerabilities. When communications failed, isolated units faced an enemy that knew every trail, every hiding place, every route of escape. At 14:15 hours, Echo Company began its descent from Hill 482. The patrol formation followed standard operating procedures developed through hard experience in Vietnam's unique tactical environment. Point man and scout moved 20 meters ahead, searching for booby traps and signs of enemy presence. The main body followed in spaced intervals, with automatic weapons positioned to provide covering fire in multiple directions. McMahon walked near the center of the formation, protected by riflemen but close enough to the company commander to relay orders and coordinate support. The jungle closed around them like a living thing. Bamboo stands reached 40 feet overhead, their canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight on the jungle floor. Vines hung in curtains, forcing Marines to cut their way forward with machetes. The air itself seemed alive, buzzing with insects, echoing with bird calls, rustling with movements that might have been wind or wildlife or something far more dangerous. Every step through Vietnam's interior required constant vigilance. The enemy had perfected the art of battlefield preparation, seeding likely patrol routes with mines, punji stakes, and carefully positioned firing positions. A single misstep could trigger a devastating ambush. American forces countered with technology, firepower, and aggressive patrolling, but the psychological strain of constant alertness wore down even veteran troops. McMahon monitored radio traffic as the patrol moved deeper into the valley. Situation reports crackled through his headset every 15 minutes. Routine updates that confirmed the company's location to higher headquarters. Aircraft checked in overhead, their jet engines barely audible through the jungle canopy but providing reassurance that help remained within reach. Artillery batteries reported ready status, guns loaded and aimed at predetermined targets around the patrol route. For 2 hours, the operation proceeded exactly as planned. Echo Company found evidence of past enemy presence. Cold cooking fires, abandoned equipment, paths worn smooth by frequent foot traffic. But no recent activity, no signs that communist forces remained in the area. The intelligence estimate appeared accurate. At 16:30 hours, everything changed. The first shot came from nowhere and everywhere. A single crack that echoed through the bamboo, followed immediately by the distinctive chatter of an AK-47 assault rifle firing on full automatic. Marines dove for cover as bullets snapped through the air around them, striking bamboo stalks and sending wood chips flying like shrapnel. McMahon hit the ground hard, his radio bouncing against his back as he rolled behind a fallen tree. The familiar weight of the PRC-25 suddenly felt enormous, making him clumsy as he tried to find cover and establish communication simultaneously. His hands, trained through months of practice, found the handset and pressed the transmission key even as his mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. The ambush revealed the tactical sophistication that made Vietnamese communist forces so formidable. Rather than attacking during the patrol movement, when American forces remained dispersed and difficult to target, the enemy had waited until Echo Company bunched up in a natural clearing. The killing zone had been prepared with overlapping fields of fire, covered approaches, and multiple escape routes. Most crucially, the ambush site lay directly beneath Hill 482, making it nearly impossible for American artillery to provide supporting fires without endangering their own troops. McMahon's radio crackled with urgent transmissions as the company commander attempted to coordinate a response. But Lieutenant Walter Morrison, a 24-year-old from Montgomery, Alabama, had taken a bullet through the leg in the first seconds of the ambush and was struggling to maintain command while applying pressure to his wound. The executive officer, 2nd Lieutenant James Park, was pinned down behind a rice paddy dike 50 meters away, unable to maneuver or communicate effectively. In the chaos of combat, radio communications became a lifeline and a burden. McMahon pressed his face into the mud, trying to shield his equipment from enemy fire while maintaining contact with supporting units. The radio's antenna, nearly 4 feet long when fully extended, made an excellent target for enemy riflemen. Every time he transmitted, muzzle flashes revealed his position. The psychological dimension of combat communications cannot be underestimated. Radio operators bore enormous responsibility for their unit's survival, but that responsibility made them prime targets for enemy fire. McMahon had trained for this moment, but training could not replicate the sensory overload of actual combat. The smell of gunpowder and blood, the confusion of overlapping orders, the terror of realizing that death could come from any direction. As the ambush intensified, McMahon realized that Echo Company faced a much larger enemy force than intelligence estimates had suggested. Automatic weapons fire came from at least 6 positions, indicating a reinforced squad or small platoon. Worse, the enemy demonstrated knowledge of American tactical procedures, shifting their fire to target key personnel like radio operators and medics. At 16:45 hours, McMahon made contact with the Direct Air Support Center. His transmission cut through the static with professional calm that belied the chaos around him. Years later, voice analysis of recovered radio logs would reveal the subtle stress markers in his speech, the slightly elevated pitch and accelerated cadence that indicated extreme duress. But to the air controllers listening from climate-controlled bunkers 50 kilometers away, Echo 2 sounded exactly as he always did. Precise, reliable, unflappable. The F-4 Phantom jets that responded to McMahon's call carried ordnance specifically configured for close air support missions, 500-pound bombs, 20mm cannon ammunition, and white phosphorus marking rockets. These aircraft, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 2, could deliver devastating firepower with surgical precision when properly directed by ground controllers. But close air support in jungle terrain required extraordinary skill and enormous courage from both pilots and ground observers. McMahon's first transmission requested immediate air support at grid coordinates that placed the target danger close to friendly positions. Danger close, in military terminology, meant that ordnance would explode within 600 meters of American troops, close enough for fragments and blast effects to cause casualties among friendly forces. Such missions required explicit confirmation from ground commanders and represented the desperate mathematics of combat, accepting certain risk from friendly fire to prevent almost certain death from enemy action. The Phantom flight leader, Major Robert Chen, responded to McMahon's call with questions that revealed the complexity of close air support coordination. Weather conditions, wind direction, friendly troop positions, enemy locations, escape routes, casualty evacuation requirements, each factor influenced weapon selection and delivery tactics. Chen had flown 47 combat missions over North Vietnam. and understood that mistakes in target identification could kill American troops as easily as enemy fire. But as Chen orbited above the jungle canopy at 8,000 feet, he faced the fundamental challenge that plagued air support throughout the Vietnam conflict, identifying targets in terrain that provided perfect concealment for both sides. The thick bamboo growth that hid enemy positions also obscured friendly troops, making it nearly impossible to distinguish combatants from several thousand feet altitude. McMahon solved this problem with a solution that demonstrated both tactical brilliance and personal courage that bordered on the suicidal. At 16:53 hours, with Echo Company's situation becoming increasingly desperate, McMahon made a decision that would be studied in military academies for decades afterward. Unable to provide precise target coordinates for aircraft overhead and watching Marines fall wounded around him, he chose to use his own position as the reference point for directing airstrikes. This decision violated every principle of safe air support procedures. Controllers were trained to remain concealed, to observe from covered positions, to never reveal their locations to enemy forces. But McMahon calculated that his unit's survival depended on immediate, accurate fire support, and the only way to ensure accuracy was to mark targets relative to his own position. He reached into his equipment pack and withdrew a smoke grenade, an AN-M18 colored smoke device designed for signaling and target marking. The grenade contained a pyrotechnic charge that produced dense colored smoke for approximately 90 seconds, creating a visual reference point that aircraft could identify from altitude. Standard procedure called for throwing smoke grenades away from friendly positions to mark enemy targets or landing zones. McMahon pulled the pin and held the grenade against his chest. The psychological transformation that occurs in combat, when ordinary individuals perform extraordinary acts, remains one of the least understood aspects of warfare. What drives a young man from Iowa to embrace almost certain death in order to save his comrades? Military psychologists have identified factors that contribute to heroic behavior under fire: unit cohesion, leadership example, training, and the human instinct to protect those who depend on you. But explanation falls short of understanding the moment when fear transforms into acceptance, when survival instinct yields to duty. As orange smoke billowed around McMahon's position, he pressed the radio handset to his lips and began directing airstrikes with methodical precision. His voice, recorded by monitoring stations and preserved in military archives, carried no trace of panic or hesitation. Each transmission provided specific adjustments to target coordinates based on his observation of where enemy muzzle flashes appeared relative to his smoke marker. The first bomb struck 100 meters north of McMahon's position. The 500-pound general-purpose bomb, delivered from an F-4 Phantom diving at nearly vertical angle, created a crater 12 feet deep and 30 feet across. The blast wave, traveling at supersonic speed through the dense air, flattened bamboo stands in a circle hundreds of meters wide. Fragments of steel casing, moving at thousands of feet per second, shredded everything within the kill radius. McMahon felt the earth heave beneath him as the explosion lifted him off the ground and slammed him back down. His ears rang from the overpressure, and dirt rained down for several seconds after the blast. But his radio continued functioning, and his voice remained steady as he called in adjustments for the next strike. The tactical effectiveness of close air support in Vietnam depended on this kind of precise coordination between aircraft and ground observers. Bombs dropped without accurate guidance often missed their targets entirely, wasting ordnance and exposing aircraft to unnecessary risk. But when properly directed, airstrikes could break up enemy attacks, destroy fortified positions, and provide psychological shock that disrupted enemy operations for hours or days afterward. McMahon directed 6 separate bombing runs over the next 15 minutes, walking ordnance progressively closer to his own position as he identified enemy firing positions. Each adjustment brought the explosions nearer to Echo Company's perimeter, but also eliminated the enemy positions that were causing the heaviest casualties. The physics of blast effects meant that McMahon was subjecting himself to increasing levels of injury with each bomb strike. Overpressure from high explosives can rupture eardrums, damage internal organs, and cause traumatic brain injury, even without direct fragment wounds. The repeated concussions from multiple explosions would have left him disoriented and potentially unconscious. Yet his radio transmissions remained coherent and tactically sound throughout the engagement. At 17:08 hours, An enemy sniper's bullet struck McMahon's radio antenna. The 4-foot whip antenna, essential for long-range communication, snapped in half at its midpoint. Without a properly functioning antenna, the PRC-25's range dropped to less than 2 kilometers, making it impossible to maintain contact with aircraft overhead or coordinate additional support. In military terminology, McMahon had lost commo, communications, the lifeline that connected isolated ground forces to the larger support network that kept them alive. But McMahon had trained for equipment failure, and his response demonstrated the kind of field expedience that kept American forces functioning despite Vietnam's harsh environment. Using a length of communication wire from his repair kit, he jury-rigged a temporary antenna that restored partial radio function. The improvised antenna provided weaker signal strength and shorter range, but enough capability to maintain contact with the Phantom jets that continued circling overhead. This kind of technical improvisation, performed under enemy fire, illustrated the individual initiative that American military training sought to develop in every soldier. Unlike more rigid military systems that emphasized following orders precisely, American doctrine encouraged adaptability and independent thinking at the lowest levels. McMahon's ability to repair his radio while bullets snapped overhead represented the successful application of these principles under the most extreme conditions. The airstrikes McMahon directed had broken the back of the enemy ambush, but Echo Company remained in desperate condition. 7 Marines were wounded, including both officers, and ammunition was running low after 20 minutes of intense firefight. Medical evacuation helicopters were standing by at Marble Mountain, but they required a secure landing zone before they could attempt casualty pickup. McMahon's next transmission requested immediate extraction for wounded personnel. The complexity of helicopter operations in Vietnam cannot be overstated. Unlike fixed-wing aircraft that could operate from established airfields with maintenance facilities and ground support equipment, helicopters ventured into remote areas where mechanical failure or enemy action could prove fatal. Medical evacuation missions, flying into active combat zones to retrieve wounded soldiers, represented some of the most dangerous operations of the entire war. UH-1 Huey helicopters, the workhorses of American air mobility in Vietnam, could carry 6 litter patients or 8 walking wounded depending on configuration. But landing in contested areas required covering fire from ground forces and often escort gunships to suppress enemy positions. The coordination between ground units, transport helicopters, and attack aircraft demanded split-second timing and flawless communication. McMahon established radio contact with the medical evacuation flight at 17:15 hours. The lead pilot, Captain Michael Rodriguez, had flown over 100 medical evacuation missions since arriving in Vietnam 6 months earlier. Rodriguez understood that pickup from Hill 482 would require landing on the hilltop itself, as the valley remained too dangerous for helicopter operations. But Echo Company was pinned down in the valley, unable to reach the hilltop without crossing open ground that was still covered by enemy fire. The tactical situation presented a classic dilemma. Wounded Marines needed immediate medical attention, but moving them exposed the entire unit to additional casualties. McMahon proposed a solution that again demonstrated his willingness to accept personal risk for unit survival. He volunteered to remain behind with the radio while Echo Company moved the wounded to the hilltop landing zone. This meant that he would stay in the valley, alone, maintaining communication with supporting aircraft while the rest of his unit withdrew to safety. If enemy forces counterattacked, or if his radio failed, he would be isolated and almost certainly killed. The moral dimension of McMahon's decision reflects the warrior ethos that military institutions seek to instill in their personnel. The willingness to sacrifice oneself for comrades represents the ultimate expression of unit loyalty and personal courage. But such decisions also illustrate the terrible mathematics of combat, where individual lives become variables in calculations about unit survival and mission success. At 17:22 hours, Echo Company began its withdrawal to Hill 482. The movement required careful coordination, with Marines providing covering fire in alternating sequence, while others carried wounded comrades up the steep hillside. McMahon's radio served as the coordination hub, maintaining contact with overhead aircraft while directing the company's movement through terrain that offered little concealment from enemy observation. The physical challenges of evacuating wounded personnel in jungle terrain tested human endurance to its limits. Each wounded Marine required 2 or 3 able-bodied carriers, reducing the unit's fighting strength while increasing its vulnerability to enemy attack. The steep hillside, slippery with mud and vegetation, made footing treacherous for men carrying heavy loads. Heat exhaustion, always a threat in Vietnam's climate, became a serious concern as Marines pushed themselves beyond normal limits. McMahon coordinated this movement while maintaining his position in the valley, directing covering fire from aircraft overhead and monitoring enemy activity through his observation of muzzle flashes and movement in the bamboo. His radio became the nerve center for a complex tactical withdrawal that required precise timing between multiple units operating in 3 dimensions. At 17:34 hours, the medical evacuation helicopter approached Hill 482. Captain Rodriguez's UH-1 appeared over the southern ridgeline, flying low and fast to minimize exposure to ground fire. The helicopter's approach created a tremendous roar that echoed across the valley, announcing its presence to any enemy forces in the area. But speed and surprise offered the best protection against the shoulder-fired missiles and heavy machine guns that Vietnamese forces increasingly used against American aircraft. McMahon watched the helicopter through binoculars, maintaining radio contact with both the pilot and the Marines on the hilltop. The landing zone measured barely 30 meters across, surrounded by tall bamboo that could tangle the helicopter's rotor blades if the pilot misjudged his approach. Wind conditions, always unpredictable in mountainous terrain, created additional hazards for an aircraft attempting to land in a confined area. The UH-1 Huey that served as the backbone of American air mobility operations in Vietnam represented a remarkable achievement in helicopter design and manufacturing. Powered by a Lycoming T-53 turboshaft engine, producing 100 shaft horsepower, the Huey could lift 4,000 pounds of cargo or personnel while maintaining the speed and maneuverability necessary for combat operations. Its simple, robust construction made it relatively easy to maintain in field conditions, while its modular design allowed rapid reconfiguration for different mission requirements. But helicopters remained vulnerable to ground fire in ways that fixed-wing aircraft were not. Their relatively slow speed and low altitude made them easy targets for small arms fire, while their mechanical complexity meant that single bullet strikes could cause catastrophic failures. Helicopter crews in Vietnam accepted enormous risks every time they flew into contested areas, knowing that mechanical failure or enemy action could prove fatal within seconds. Rodriguez's approach to Hill 482 required extraordinary skill and considerable courage. The hilltop landing zone lay within range of the enemy positions that had ambushed Echo Company, meaning that the helicopter would be exposed to ground fire throughout its landing approach and departure. The pilot had to balance speed, which provided protection from enemy fire, against control requirements for a safe landing in confined terrain. At 17:36 hours, the first medical evacuation was completed successfully. 4 wounded Marines were loaded aboard Rodriguez's helicopter in 90 seconds, a testament to the efficiency that American forces developed in casualty evacuation procedures. Each wounded man represented a victory against the enemy's attempt to inflict maximum American casualties, but also a reminder of the human cost that measured every tactical success in Vietnam. McMahon coordinated a second helicopter landing at 17:41 hours, this time carrying the remaining wounded Marines and most of Echo Company's personnel, but he remained in the valley with his radio, continuing to monitor enemy activity and coordinate with overhead aircraft. His voice, recorded in radio logs, showed signs of fatigue, but maintained the professional calm that had characterized his performance throughout the engagement. The decision to remain behind reflected McMahon's understanding that communications capability represented Echo Company's most valuable asset. Without radio contact, the Marines on Hill 482 would be isolated from supporting fires and unable to call for assistance if enemy forces mounted a counterattack. His radio theoretically could coordinate support from his position in the valley as effectively as from the hilltop, but remaining below exposed him to almost certain capture or death if enemy forces advanced. At 17:48 hours, McMahon reported movement in the bamboo groves east of his position. His transmission, barely audible through static and interference, indicated that enemy forces were maneuvering to cut off his escape route to Hill 482. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, with McMahon becoming increasingly isolated as communist forces closed in around his position. Yet he continued transmitting situation reports and coordinating with aircraft overhead, treating his own survival as secondary to his communications responsibility. The psychology of radio operators in combat situations involves a unique form of stress that combines physical danger with enormous responsibility for others' lives. Unlike riflemen, who can focus primarily on their immediate survival, radio operators must maintain broader situational awareness while coordinating between multiple units and agencies. The mental demands of processing information, making rapid decisions, and communicating clearly under extreme stress can be overwhelming even for highly trained personnel. McMahon's performance under these conditions demonstrated the effectiveness of military communications training, but also revealed the personal qualities that distinguish exceptional soldiers from merely competent ones. His ability to maintain tactical focus while facing almost certain death reflected a level of military professionalism that transcended technical training. At 17:53 hours, enemy small arms fire began impacting McMahon's position. Automatic weapons fire, probably from AK-47 assault rifles, struck the ground around him with increasing accuracy as enemy forces closed the range. McMahon moved his position twice, crawling through the mud and vegetation while keeping his radio operational, but his options for concealment were rapidly disappearing. His transmissions during this period, preserved in military archives, provide insight into the mental state of a man facing almost certain death while continuing to perform his military duties. McMahon's voice remained steady, his tactical reports accurate and complete. He described enemy positions, movement patterns, and weapon capabilities with the same precision he had demonstrated throughout the engagement. At 17:56 hours, McMahon made his final transmission about tactical matters. He reported that enemy forces had moved to within 50 meters of his position and were preparing for a final assault. His radio battery power was failing after hours of continuous transmission, and his improvised antenna had been damaged by near misses from enemy fire. Communication with overhead aircraft was becoming intermittent, and he estimated that radio contact would be lost entirely within minutes. But McMahon's last tactical report included information that proved crucial for subsequent operations in the area. He had identified at least 3 enemy machine gun positions, 2 mortar sites, and what appeared to be a supply cache hidden in the bamboo groves. This intelligence, transmitted while under direct fire, enabled later operations to neutralize enemy capabilities and prevent similar ambushes. The final seconds of McMahon's radio operation demonstrated the intersection of technology, training, and human courage that characterized American military performance in Vietnam. His ability to maintain communications under impossible conditions provided the coordination necessary for Echo Company's survival, but also illustrated the terrible price that individual soldiers paid for tactical success. At 17:58 hours, McMahon's radio went silent. The sudden cessation of transmissions from Echo 2 created immediate concern at the Direct Air Support Center and Artillery Fire Direction Centers that had been coordinating with him throughout the engagement. Without ground observer guidance, supporting fires became impossible to coordinate safely. The Marines on Hill 482 were effectively cut off from the support network that had sustained them during the ambush. But McMahon's sacrifice had achieved its purpose. Echo Company had successfully withdrawn from the killing zone, evacuated all wounded personnel, and established a defensive position on Hill 482 that could be resupplied and reinforced if necessary. The immediate tactical crisis had passed, though at enormous personal cost to the young radio operator who had made their survival possible. Recovery operations began immediately, but dense jungle and continued enemy presence made search efforts extremely hazardous. Helicopter reconnaissance flights over the valley drew heavy ground fire, confirming that communist forces remained in the area in significant numbers. Ground patrols attempting to reach McMahon's last known position encountered prepared defensive positions and were forced to withdraw after taking casualties. 3 days later, a Marine reconnaissance team found McMahon's body. He had died at his radio, the handset still pressed to his ear, apparently attempting to transmit even after his equipment had failed. The PRC-25 showed evidence of multiple bullet strikes, but McMahon had continued operating it until power failure made communication impossible. His final position lay less than 20 meters from a major enemy supply route, suggesting that he had maintained observation and reporting responsibilities literally until the moment of death. The physical evidence recovered with McMahon's body told the story of his final minutes. His rifle had been fired repeatedly, indicating that he had defended himself while continuing radio operations. Equipment scattered around his position showed that he had attempted multiple repairs to his damaged antenna and radio components. Most significantly, his final written message, found in his equipment pack, contained grid coordinates and tactical information about enemy positions observed during his last hours. McMahon's body was recovered along with his radio and personal equipment, but the intelligence he had gathered proved invaluable for subsequent operations. The enemy positions he had identified were systematically targeted by airstrikes and artillery fire over the following weeks, disrupting communist operations throughout the Duc Pho area and preventing similar ambushes. Military funeral honors for Lance Corporal Charles Douglas McMahon were conducted at Arlington National Cemetery on August 15, 1966. His parents, who had received the telegram informing them of his death while working in their Cedar Rapids garden, traveled to Washington to see their son buried among the nation's honored dead. The ceremony included full military honors, honor guard, flag presentation, 21-gun salute, and the haunting melody of taps played by a Marine Corps bugler. But McMahon's legacy extended far beyond the formal recognition of his sacrifice. The radio procedures he had demonstrated under fire became case studies in military communication schools, illustrating how individual initiative and technical competence could determine unit survival in combat. His improvised antenna repairs were incorporated into field manuals, teaching subsequent generations of radio operators how to maintain communications despite equipment damage. Most importantly, his example of communications discipline under extreme stress became the standard against which military radio operators measured their own performance. The tactical lessons learned from McMahon's final battle influenced American military doctrine in Vietnam and beyond. His demonstrated ability to coordinate close air support from ground observer positions led to enhanced training programs for forward air controllers and radio operators. The effectiveness of danger close air support missions, when properly coordinated, became a cornerstone of American tactical doctrine in subsequent conflicts. Analysis of the audio recordings from McMahon's final transmissions revealed subtle voice stress patterns that helped develop better training methods for communications personnel. Military psychologists studied his performance under extreme duress to understand how training and personal character contribute to exceptional performance during combat. These studies influenced selection criteria and training programs for radio operators and forward air controllers throughout the military. The technological lessons from McMahon's final battle also contributed to improvements in military communications equipment. The vulnerability of radio antennas to enemy fire led to development of shorter, more robust antenna designs that maintained effectiveness while reducing target signatures. Battery life improvements, ruggedized construction, and better field repair procedures all trace their origins partially to analysis of equipment failures during actions like the Hill 482 engagement. But perhaps most significantly, McMahon's story became part of the moral tradition that sustained American forces through the darkest periods of the Vietnam conflict. When young Marines faced impossible situations in jungle clearings or mountain hilltops across South Vietnam, they carried with them the example of a radio operator who had chosen duty over survival, who had maintained his post when retreat would have been both prudent and forgivable. The strategic implications of individual heroism in warfare cannot be measured by conventional metrics, but they profoundly influence military effectiveness. Units that possess strong traditions of courage and self-sacrifice demonstrate superior performance under stress, maintain unit cohesion despite casualties, and accomplish missions that exceed their theoretical capabilities. McMahon's example contributed to this tradition within the Marine Corps, inspiring subsequent generations of Marines to similar acts of valor. In the broader context of the Vietnam War, McMahon's story illustrates both the effectiveness and the terrible cost of American military tactics. The sophisticated coordination between ground forces, aircraft, and supporting arms that saved Echo Company from annihilation represented a remarkable achievement in military technology and training. But this coordination depended on individuals willing to accept extraordinary risks to maintain communications and coordinate supporting fires. The human dimension of military technology remains its most critical component. Advanced radios, precision-guided munitions, and sophisticated aircraft provide capabilities that can multiply the effectiveness of small units, but they require skilled operators who understand both the technical and tactical aspects of their employment. McMahon's mastery of both dimensions enabled him to coordinate the complex air support mission that saved 36 of his fellow Marines. The moral complexity of warfare appears clearly in McMahon's final battle. His death represented both a tactical success and a human tragedy, both a necessary sacrifice and a devastating loss. The Marines who survived because of his courage went on to fight additional battles, face additional dangers, and in some cases make similar sacrifices for their comrades. The mathematics of combat, which weigh individual lives against unit survival and mission accomplishment, create moral dilemmas that have no clean resolution. Yet McMahon's choice transcended these calculations. His decision to remain at his radio post, to direct airstrikes from his own position, and to maintain communications until the moment of death reflected values that exist independent of tactical necessity. Duty, loyalty, courage, and self-sacrifice represent ideals that give meaning to military service and enable ordinary individuals to perform extraordinary acts under impossible conditions. The technological marvels that supported American forces in Vietnam, jet aircraft capable of supersonic flight, sophisticated radio equipment, precision-guided munitions, ultimately depended on individuals who possessed the moral courage to employ them effectively under fire. Without McMahon's willingness to accept almost certain death in order to coordinate air support, the technological advantages that American forces possessed would have been irrelevant to Echo Company's survival. The aftermath of the Hill 482 engagement demonstrated both the effectiveness and limitations of American tactics in Vietnam. The immediate tactical success, Echo Company's successful withdrawal, and the disruption of enemy operations in the area was achieved at enormous cost in human terms. McMahon's death represented not only a personal tragedy, but also the loss of irreplaceable skills and experience that could not be quickly replaced. Military historians studying the Vietnam conflict have identified hundreds of similar actions where individual courage and technical competence determined unit survival. Radio operators, medics, forward air controllers, and helicopter pilots repeatedly demonstrated the kind of selfless heroism that McMahon exemplified at Hill 482. Their collective sacrifices enabled American forces to maintain tactical effectiveness despite operating in an environment that favored their enemies in almost every respect. But the strategic implications of these individual acts of heroism remain ambiguous. McMahon's sacrifice saved 36 Marines who went on to fight additional battles in a conflict that ultimately ended in American withdrawal and communist victory. The tactical expertise that enabled American units to survive and inflict heavy casualties on their enemies could not overcome the strategic and political factors that determined the war's ultimate outcome. This ambiguity reflects the complex relationship between individual heroism and strategic success in modern warfare. McMahon's courage was absolute and admirable regardless of the war's final outcome, but it also illustrates the limits of tactical excellence in achieving strategic objectives. The same qualities that enabled American forces to dominate most battlefield encounters, superior firepower, advanced technology, and exceptional individual performance, proved insufficient to achieve the political goals that justify military action. The legacy of McMahon's sacrifice extends beyond the Vietnam War to influence contemporary military operations and training. Modern communications equipment, while far more sophisticated than the PRC-25 radios of the 1960s, still requires skilled operators who understand both technical capabilities and tactical applications. Current military doctrine emphasizes the same principles of coordination and integration that McMahon demonstrated during his final battle. Contemporary forward air controllers and joint terminal attack controllers receive training that builds directly on lessons learned from actions like the Hill 482 engagement. The procedures for coordinating close air support, the techniques for maintaining communications under fire, and the moral preparation for accepting extreme risks to support fellow service members all trace their origins to examples like McMahon's final battle. The Marine Corps institutional memory preserves McMahon's story as part of the warrior tradition that defines Corps culture. Young Marines learn about his sacrifice during training, not as abstract military history but as a concrete example of the standards they are expected to meet. His name appears on memorial walls, his story is told in leadership classes, and his example continues to inspire Marines facing their own moments of trial. But the most important legacy of McMahon's sacrifice may be its demonstration that individual moral choice can transcend even the most desperate circumstances. When faced with almost certain death, with every rational calculation arguing for retreat or surrender, he chose to remain at his post and continue fulfilling his duty to his fellow Marines. This choice reflected values that cannot be quantified in tactical manuals or strategic assessments, but that ultimately determine whether military organizations maintain their effectiveness under extreme stress. The relationship between individual heroism and unit effectiveness represents one of the most important factors in military performance, but also one of the least understood. Organizations that cultivate traditions of courage and self-sacrifice demonstrate superior performance across multiple metrics, but the process by which individual examples inspire collective excellence remains largely mysterious. McMahon's story provides insight into this process by illustrating how one individual's extraordinary performance under fire can establish standards that influence entire units and, eventually, entire military organizations. His example demonstrated that exceptional performance under impossible conditions was achievable, making similar acts by other service members seem possible rather than superhuman. The technical aspects of McMahon's final battle also continue to influence military communications and close air support procedures. The improvised antenna repairs he performed under fire became standard training for radio operators, while his techniques for coordinating airstrikes from forward positions influenced doctrine for forward air controllers throughout the military. Modern precision-guided munitions and advanced target acquisition systems have reduced the risks associated with danger close air support missions, but they cannot eliminate the requirement for skilled ground observers who can identify targets and coordinate attacks under combat conditions. McMahon's example remains relevant because it demonstrates the human factors that determine whether advanced military technology can be employed effectively in combat. The psychological dimensions of McMahon's performance, his ability to maintain technical precision and tactical awareness while facing almost certain death, also continue to influence military training and personnel selection. Military psychologists study his recorded radio transmissions to understand how training and personal character interact to produce exceptional performance under extreme stress. These studies have contributed to improved selection criteria for military occupational specialties that require performance under stress, better training methods for developing stress tolerance in military personnel, and enhanced understanding of the psychological factors that contribute to heroic behavior in combat. While the specific techniques and technologies of warfare continue to evolve, the human factors that determine military effectiveness remain relatively constant. The moral dimensions of McMahon's sacrifice also provide timeless lessons about the nature of military service and the relationship between individual responsibility and collective security. His willingness to accept almost certain death in order to save his comrades reflects values that transcend specific conflicts or historical periods, speaking to fundamental questions about duty, loyalty, and the obligations that individuals owe to their communities. These moral questions become particularly acute in democratic societies, where military service is voluntary and citizens must choose whether to accept the risks and responsibilities of defending their nation. McMahon's example illustrates both the extraordinary demands that military service can place on individuals and the extraordinary capacity for heroism that ordinary people can demonstrate when called upon. The intersection of technology, training, and moral character that McMahon's story illustrates remains central to military effectiveness in the contemporary era. Advanced weapons systems, sophisticated communications equipment, and precision-guided munitions provide unprecedented capabilities, but they still require operators who possess the technical skills, tactical knowledge, and moral courage necessary to employ them effectively under combat conditions. McMahon's final battle demonstrates that these three elements, technical competence, tactical understanding, and moral courage, are inseparable in military operations. His technical mastery of radio equipment enabled him to maintain communications despite equipment damage and enemy fire. His tactical understanding of air support procedures allowed him to coordinate effective strikes against enemy positions. But his moral courage provided the foundation that made his technical and tactical skills relevant when survival instincts argued for abandoning his post. Military training programs attempt to develop all three elements simultaneously, but they cannot replicate the extreme stress conditions that reveal whether training has been truly internalized. Combat remains the ultimate test of whether individuals possess the integration of skills, knowledge, and character necessary for exceptional military performance. McMahon's story also illustrates the cumulative effect of individual actions on strategic outcomes. While his sacrifice could not determine the ultimate outcome of the Vietnam War, it contributed to the tactical effectiveness that enabled American forces to dominate most battlefield encounters throughout the conflict. The aggregate of thousands of similar acts of individual courage and competence shaped the war's character, even if they could not determine its conclusion. This relationship between individual performance and strategic outcomes reflects the complex nature of modern warfare, where tactical excellence may be necessary but not sufficient for achieving strategic objectives. McMahon's heroism was complete and admirable, regardless of the war's final outcome, but it also demonstrates the limitations that individual actions face when operating within larger strategic and political contexts that may be beyond their influence. The documentation of McMahon's final battle also provides valuable insight into the nature of historical memory and the process by which individual acts of heroism become part of collective memory. His story survived because it was witnessed by his fellow Marines, recorded in official military reports, and preserved in institutional memory through training programs and historical accounts. But the preservation of his memory also reflects conscious choices by military institutions and society at large about which stories deserve remembrance and which values deserve perpetuation. McMahon's sacrifice is remembered not only because it was extraordinary, but because it exemplified qualities that military organizations and American society continue to value and seek to cultivate. The process by which individual acts of heroism become part of cultural memory involves complex interactions between official recognition, institutional preservation, and popular acceptance. McMahon's story has achieved lasting significance because it resonates with widely shared values about duty, sacrifice, and the obligations that individuals owe to their communities, particularly during times of crisis. Contemporary military operations continue to produce examples of individual heroism that parallel McMahon's sacrifice, though the specific technologies and tactical situations have evolved considerably since 1966. Radio operators, forward air controllers, medics, and other military specialists continue to face situations where their technical skills, tactical judgment, and moral courage determine whether their units survive and accomplish their missions. The fundamental challenges that McMahon faced, maintaining communications under fire, coordinating complex support operations while under attack, and choosing duty over personal survival, remain central to military operations in the contemporary era. While the specific equipment and procedures have become more sophisticated, the basic requirements for exceptional military performance under extreme stress remain essentially unchanged. Modern military communication systems provide capabilities that McMahon could hardly have imagined. Satellite communications that are nearly immune to jamming, digital encryption that prevents enemy interception, and miniaturized equipment that is far lighter and more reliable than the PRC-25 radios of the Vietnam era. But these technological advances still require operators who possess the technical knowledge, tactical understanding, and moral commitment necessary to employ them effectively under combat conditions. The human dimension of military technology remains its most critical and most fragile component. McMahon's story demonstrates that advanced equipment capabilities are meaningless unless operated by individuals who understand their tactical applications and possess the moral courage to employ them effectively when circumstances require extraordinary risks. This relationship between human factors and technological capabilities continues to influence military training, doctrine, and equipment development. Recognition that individual performance ultimately determines whether technological advantages can be translated into tactical and strategic success has led to increased emphasis on personnel selection, training quality, and leadership development throughout modern military organizations. The lessons learned from McMahon's final battle continue to resonate because they address fundamental questions about human performance under extreme stress. Questions that remain relevant regardless of changes in military technology or tactical doctrine. How does training prepare individuals for situations that exceed normal human experience? What personal qualities enable some individuals to maintain performance standards while others break under pressure? How do individual acts of heroism influence collective military effectiveness? These questions cannot be answered through purely technical analysis because they involve psychological, moral, and social factors that resist simple quantification. McMahon's story provides insight into these questions, not because it offers definitive answers, but because it illustrates how technical competence, tactical understanding, and moral courage can integrate to produce exceptional performance under impossible conditions. The study of individual heroism in military operations also reveals the limitations of conventional analytical approaches to understanding warfare. While tactical analysis can explain how McMahon coordinated air support and technical analysis can describe his equipment capabilities and failures, neither approach fully captures the moral dimension that made his sacrifice meaningful. This moral dimension involves questions about duty, loyalty, and the obligations that individuals owe to their communities that cannot be reduced to tactical or strategic calculations. McMahon's choice to remain at his radio post despite almost certain death operated according to logic that transcended narrow self-interest or even rational risk assessment. Understanding this moral dimension is crucial for military organizations because it provides the foundation that enables individuals to perform exceptionally when tactical and strategic calculations alone would argue for different choices. Military effectiveness ultimately depends on the willingness of individuals to accept extraordinary risks and make extraordinary sacrifices for their comrades and their missions. The cultivation of this moral dimension requires more than technical training or tactical instruction. It involves the development of character qualities and value commitments that enable individuals to transcend normal limitations when circumstances require exceptional performance. Military organizations attempt to develop these qualities through training programs that emphasize unit cohesion, leadership by example, and institutional traditions that honor previous examples of heroism and self-sacrifice. McMahon's story has become part of these institutional traditions within the Marine Corps and the broader American military establishment. His example is cited in leadership training, commemorated in ceremonies, and preserved in historical accounts that serve both educational and inspirational purposes. But the effectiveness of these institutional efforts to cultivate heroism remains difficult to assess because the ultimate test occurs only under combat conditions that cannot be fully replicated in training environments. The relationship between institutional programs designed to develop character and the actual performance of individuals under extreme stress remains complex and only partially understood. McMahon's performance suggests that effective character development requires the integration of technical competence, tactical knowledge, and moral commitment in ways that make them mutually reinforcing rather than competing. His technical mastery of radio operations provided the foundation that made his tactical coordination possible. His understanding of air support procedures enabled him to translate moral commitment into effective action. His moral courage provided the motivation that sustained technical and tactical performance when survival instincts argued for abandonment of duty. This integration of technical, tactical, and moral dimensions represents the ideal that military training programs seek to achieve, but it remains an exceptional accomplishment that most individuals achieve only partially, if at all. McMahon's story is remembered precisely because it represents this integration at its highest level, demonstrating what becomes possible when technical skill, tactical understanding, and moral courage combine completely. The preservation of McMahon's story also serves practical purposes within military organizations by providing concrete examples of the standards that personnel are expected to meet and the performance that becomes possible when training, character, and circumstances align properly. New Marines learn about his sacrifice not as abstract inspiration, but as a realistic demonstration of the capabilities they are expected to develop and the decisions they may be required to make. This practical application of heroic examples represents one of the most important functions of military institutional memory, transforming individual acts of exceptional performance into collective standards that influence entire organizations. McMahon's example continues to inspire Marines facing their own moments of crisis by demonstrating that exceptional performance under impossible conditions is achievable, not supernatural. The technological legacy of McMahon's final battle also continues to influence military communications and close air support procedures. The equipment failures he experienced and overcame led to improvements in radio design, antenna construction, and field repair procedures that reduced similar failures in subsequent operations. More importantly, his demonstration of the tactical effectiveness of properly coordinated close air support from forward observer positions influenced doctrine development and training programs throughout the military. The procedures he improvised under fire became standard techniques taught to forward air controllers and radio operators in military schools. Contemporary precision-guided munitions and advanced targeting systems have reduced some of the risks associated with danger close air support missions, but they have not eliminated the requirement for skilled ground observers who can identify targets and coordinate attacks under combat conditions. McMahon's techniques for target identification and strike coordination remain relevant because they address fundamental requirements for effective air support that persist despite technological advances. The strategic implications of McMahon's sacrifice extend beyond its immediate tactical effects to influence broader questions about military effectiveness and the relationship between individual performance and strategic outcomes. His act of heroism contributed to the tactical success that characterized most American military operations in Vietnam, even though tactical success proved insufficient to achieve the strategic objectives that justified American involvement in the conflict. This disconnect between tactical effectiveness and strategic success illustrates one of the central paradoxes of the Vietnam War and provides important lessons for contemporary military operations. Exceptional individual performance, superior technology, and tactical dominance cannot compensate for strategic confusion or political objectives that lack sustainable public support. McMahon's heroism was complete and admirable regardless of the war's ultimate outcome. But his story also demonstrates the limitations that individual actions face when operating within strategic frameworks that may be fundamentally flawed. Recognition of these limitations does not diminish the moral significance of his sacrifice, but it does provide important perspective on the relationship between military effectiveness and political success. The contemporary relevance of McMahon's example extends beyond its historical significance to address ongoing questions about military service, civic obligation, and the relationship between individual responsibility and collective security in democratic societies. His willingness to sacrifice his life for his comrades reflects values that remain central to effective military organizations and democratic citizenship more broadly. These values include recognition that individual freedom and security depend on the willingness of some citizens to accept extraordinary risks and responsibilities for the common good. McMahon's sacrifice illustrates both the demands that democratic societies may place on their citizens and the extraordinary capacity for heroism that ordinary people can demonstrate when called upon. The moral example that McMahon's story provides transcends specific military applications to address fundamental questions about duty, loyalty, and the obligations that individuals owe to their communities during times of crisis. His choice to remain at his post despite almost certain death reflects commitment to values that give meaning to democratic institutions and enable societies to survive existential challenges. Understanding and preserving these values requires more than abstract philosophical discussion. It demands concrete examples of individuals who have translated moral commitments into action under the most demanding circumstances possible. McMahon's story provides such an example, demonstrating how ordinary people can achieve extraordinary moral significance through their choices and actions. The educational value of McMahon's example extends beyond military training to encompass broader questions about character development, moral education, and the cultivation of civic virtue in democratic societies. His story illustrates how individual choices can have consequences that extend far beyond personal survival or immediate tactical objectives to influence the survival and effectiveness of entire communities. This educational dimension explains why McMahon's story continues to be told and retold in military schools, civic organizations, and historical accounts. His example provides a concrete demonstration of abstract moral principles, showing how duty, loyalty, and self-sacrifice can be translated into action under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The universality of the values that McMahon's sacrifice represents ensures its continued relevance across changing historical circumstances and evolving military technologies. While the specific conditions of his final battle cannot be replicated, the moral choices he faced and the character qualities he demonstrated remain relevant to contemporary challenges in military service and democratic citizenship. Future generations of service members will face different technologies, different enemies, and different tactical situations than those McMahon encountered on Hill 482. But they will face the same fundamental choice between duty and personal survival, the same requirement to maintain performance under extreme stress, and the same opportunity to demonstrate the moral courage that transforms ordinary individuals into heroes. McMahon's story provides them with a concrete example of how that transformation can occur and what becomes possible when technical competence, tactical understanding, and moral courage combine completely. His legacy lies not in the specific techniques he employed or the particular equipment he mastered, but in the integration of skill, knowledge, and character that enabled him to transcend normal human limitations when his comrades' lives depended on his performance. This integration represents the highest aspiration of military training and moral development, the point where technical capability and ethical commitment merge to produce exceptional human performance. McMahon achieved this integration at the cost of his life, but his example continues to inspire others to attempt similar achievements under their own challenging circumstances. The preservation of his memory serves both commemorative and practical purposes, honoring his sacrifice while providing guidance for those who face similar challenges. His story has become part of the institutional memory that sustains military organizations and democratic societies through their most difficult periods, reminding each generation of the standards previous generations established and the capabilities that remain achievable when courage and competence combine. In the end, McMahon's legacy transcends the specific circumstances of his death to address timeless questions about human possibility and moral significance. His story demonstrates that ordinary individuals can achieve extraordinary importance through their choices and actions, that technical skill without moral courage remains incomplete, and that the willingness to sacrifice for others provides the foundation on which communities and nations ultimately depend for their survival and flourishing. The radio fell silent on Hill 482, but the voice that had coordinated salvation for 36 Marines continues to echo through the decades. In every training exercise where young service members learn to coordinate fire support under pressure, in every moment when duty conflicts with survival, in every choice between personal safety and collective security, McMahon's example provides guidance and inspiration. His sacrifice reminds us that heroism remains possible, that individual choices can have consequences far beyond their immediate circumstances, and that the values we claim to cherish must sometimes be purchased with the ultimate price. The transmission that saved 37 men ended in static and silence, but its message continues to resonate wherever courage is needed and demonstrated. Can we hear that voice today, when our own moments of testing arrive, when the easy choice conflicts with the right choice, when our communities depend on our willingness to serve something larger than ourselves? The radio may be silent, but the example endures, waiting for each generation to decide whether they will answer the call. If this story of extraordinary courage and sacrifice has moved you, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with others. These stories of heroism and dedication deserve to be remembered and honored. In sharing them, we ensure that the memory of those who gave everything for their brothers in arms continues to inspire future generations. Their legacy lives on through our commitment to never forget their sacrifice.